So, going back to the calculation of mental age, I should clarify that this was originally developed by Lewis Terman. So, Lewis Terman was a researcher, and unlike Binet, he actually believed that intelligence was a fixed quality, not one that could actually be increased through education. It's he that really came up with our modern conception of the IQ score. He tended to find that the norms that were developed for French children didn't really work well for California kids. And this is because he was a researcher at Stanford, which is in California. And so he ended up adapting these norms, increasing the calculation and the questions for teenagers, as well as what he considered superior adults, and then developed this test into what was termed the Stanford Binet. And then after that, it was bought out by Wechsler and then very quickly became the Waves. And so let's talk a little bit about how you calculate IQ for people that are not children, because it's hard to come up with a mental age for adults and older teenagers. And this largely comes through a process known as standardization. So I want to take some time to talk a little bit about things that good intelligence tests tend to have. They tend to have these three different qualities to them. And so IQ is usually determined on the basis of what we call standardization. Now, odds are pretty good that at some point in your scholastic career, you have had something that's called a standardized test. So why'd they call it a standardized test? They call it a standardized test because these questions are sent out to a pre-tested group. So they try to get what the average score is. And then they give you the test. And they compare your performance with the performance of this pre-tested group. And so for adults and teenagers, IQ is actually calculated on the basis of how well you perform compared to this pre-tested group. So if your IQ is around 100, that indicates that you're performing about as well as the average for that pre-tested group. If you're performing worse than the pre-tested group, your IQ is going to be below 100. If you're performing better than that pre-tested group, your IQ is going to be over 100. And so we'll talk about what this looks like, what this standardization creates in just a second. We're going to talk about the fact that IQ scores are designed to conform to a normal distribution or a normal curve, and it has some really special properties that we'll get to in just a minute. I'll try not to get too much of my research methods on, but there's no guarantee of that. Now, a couple of other things that a good test needs to have is both reliability and validity. So reliability is the idea that the test should give you approximately the same score every time you take it. Now, it may not be perfect, but you should be kind of falling within the same range over and over again. So if I take an IQ test and I get 125 IQ on one day, if I take it a month later, I should get around that same score. If I pull like a 75, something is wrong. And then finally, we have the issue of validity. Validity is the idea that the test actually measures what it says it's going to measure. Tests can be reliable, but they may not necessarily be valid. So if we have a valid test, we've designed it in such a way that it's actually measuring a metric of intelligence and not anything else. So we need to make sure that the test measures what it says it will. Now, when we do this standardization, what we're going to see is that IQ tends to follow a bell curve. So what we tend to find with the normal distribution is that most people are going to be centered within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So one fun fact about the normal distribution is that the mean, the average, is also the median, which means that 50% of scores fall above it, 50% of scores fall below it, and it's also the mode, the most frequently occurring value. When we map IQ onto the normal distribution, 100 is the average. It is also the median, which means 50% of the population scores above 100, 50% of the population scores below 100, and then it's also the mode. If you looked at a lot of different people, odds are pretty good. Most of them would be centered around 100. It's the mode. It's the most frequently occurring value. Now, what you're going to notice is that we also have a standard deviation of the mean. That's about how spread out these scores are. And for IQ, one standard deviation is 15 IQ points. So what this means is that about 34% of people are one standard deviation above the mean, which means that 34% of the population will have an IQ between 100 and 115. Now, likewise, we'll see that 34% of the population has a standard deviation of -1. So that's 15 points below the mean. And so 34% of people will have an IQ between 85 and 100. Taken together, 68% of the population will have an IQ between 85 and 115. Now, when we add about 95% of the population, 96% of the population are actually going to fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So 30 points. So in this particular case, a good chunk of people will fall between 100 and 130. And then another chunk will fall between 100 and 70. So 95% of people are going to fall between 70 and 130. And that leaves about the remaining 5% that are divided into 2 extremes that are really, really different from each other. About 2% have an IQ of 130 or over. This is what we would call high intelligence, very high intelligence. Sometimes if they're kids, we call them gifted and talented. And then we also have 2% of people that have IQs below 70. In this particular case, we would say that they have intellectual disabilities. So a valid test is actually going to divide 2 groups of people into 2 extremes that are very significantly different from each other. So we've got our very high intelligence or gifted people. They're 130 or higher. They're beyond 2 standard deviations from the mean. And then we have intellectual disabilities, people who are under 70, and that's about 2% as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about genes and environmental influences on intelligence. And this is really important. Is intelligence nature or nurture? And generally speaking, if you hear me talk about this in psychology, 9 times out of 10, the answer is going to be it's a little bit of both. But we should care about this because if nurture plays a role in how intelligence develops, you can actually do something to change it. Now, one of the first things that I will mention is that there is a significant genetic contribution to intelligence. One of the ways that we can actually look at this is by looking at different groups of twins. Identical twins who share 100% of the same genes versus fraternal twins or siblings that only share about 50% of their genes. And what you'll notice is that for identical twins that are raised in the same environment together, their correlation between intelligence test scores is about 85%. Now, it's not perfect, so that's important. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's a pretty sizable correlation. 0.85 is pretty huge for a correlation coefficient. Now, when we look at identical twins that are reared apart, that correlation drops to a little over 0.7. This is really important. This shows that there are some environmental effects there. When you look at fraternal twins that are reared together, they're the same age, they have the same environment, but they don't have all of the same genes. You'll notice that the correlation between intelligence scores drops even further, showing that there are strong genetic effects here. When you look at siblings that are raised together, slightly different environment. You wouldn't treat an 8-year-old the same way you would treat a 5-year-old. And they share only 50% of the same genes. The correlation drops to below 0.5. When you look at unrelated individuals living together, the correlation drops even further. So what this tells us is that yes, environment matters, but it looks like genes might matter quite a bit as well. When we look at adoption studies, when we compare adopted children to both their adoptive parents and their biological parents, we get that same evidence of a strong genetic component. So here you're looking at children and their birth parents, adopted children and their birth parents, and adopted children and their adoptive parents. At the age of 3 years, the correlations are not really very strong. By the time that you get to 16 years of age, you'll notice that children have a strong correlation with their birth parents, as do adopted children with their birth parents. On the other hand, you'll notice that there's not really much of a correlation between adopted children and their adoptive parents. So intelligence has a sizable genetic component. Now, I want to be very, very clear here. I'm going to introduce a concept known as heritability. That is not talking about your genes at an individual level. We're talking about the variability in a population. So if I gave the entire class an IQ test, everybody's going to be different. And so there's going to be some variability there. How much of that variability is due to genetics? And that's what heritability is. So heritability is the variation in intelligence scores that we can attribute to differences in genetics. And about 50% of the variation across the population in terms of intelligence is due to heredity. Now, that tells you something. There's a strong genetic component there, but that means that the other 50% is not genetic. That must mean that nurture is also involved somehow. We do know that there are group differences in intelligence test scores. That's just a fact. In particular, this becomes really important when we talk about differences between racial and ethnic groups. We also do see some slight differences in gender as well. So how do we make sense of these differences? Now, your book ends up with one conclusion. I end up with a slightly different one, but this is just my opinion here. So here's what we know. When we talk about race and ethnicity, it is very well reported that racial groups differ in their average intelligence scores. So your textbook actually notes that here, that this happens across the globe. In general, groups that tend to be more privileged tend to score higher on intelligence tests than groups that have typically been oppressed. So your book notes that New Zealanders of European descent, who tend to be more privileged, tend to score higher in IQ tests than native Maori New Zealanders. Japanese people tend to score higher than Burakumin, which is a stigmatized minority in Japan. Here in the United States, we know that white and Asian Americans do tend to score higher on IQ tests than people who are Latinx or people who are Black. And that gap is closing, but there's still a gap there. And unlike some other people, I am more inclined to believe that this is due to the environment that we're in. These tests are often developed by people who are privileged, and they're going to put on the test what they think the privileged culture will value. If you are a part of a marginalized or oppressed group, you're not necessarily going to have a full understanding of what the privileged culture values, and that's going to put you at a disadvantage. Now, your book doesn't take that tack. I kind of do. Here's something else that we know. High-scoring people and high-scoring groups are more likely to attain high levels of both education and income. So this is very innately tied into the concept of privilege here. And this is as a whole. We're not talking at an individual level here. We are talking at the group level. Now, why do I think that this is largely environmental, and your book would make similar claims? We will talk about this next time.